We want to welcome Florida State University professor Paul Renfro, who is releasing a book focusing on an Indiana teenager who became the face of the AIDS epidemic. The book is titled The Life and Death of Ryan White, AIDS and Inequality in America. Ryan White was a young boy from Kokomo battling a blood disorder. He was 13 when he was diagnosed with AIDS, infected during a blood transfusion in 1984. He died in April of 1990, 1 month before his high school graduation. Professor Renfro, so good to have you here with us today to talk about this topic and this young boy who is from our state here. Your work looks deeply at the AIDS, HIV epidemic in the work. So this was a time we really knew not much about the disease.
Right, especially when Ryan contracted HIV in the early to mid 1980s. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty surrounding the disease, and a lot of that played out here in Indiana as he was barred from attending school in the Kokomo area, in Rushville specifically, and a lot of that was predicated on misinformation about the disease, but also just a lack of understanding and a lack of really kind of scientific knowledge about the disease.
Your book and your research examined a time when so many in the gay community, especially minority communities inside the gay community, were dying from HIV, AIDS. But then it looked at how this was taken seriously when this affected a population that generally seemed to be removed from this issue and from this epidemic.
Right. So Ryan White became the face of AIDS, and he became really the innocent face of AIDS, and I use kind of scare quotes around innocent because there's this idea that he somehow contracted this through no fault of his own, and the implication is that others were somehow to blame for their misfortune, right, for contracting HIV and dealing with AIDS. And a lot of that, I think, was premised on stigmas surrounding certain forms of sex, certain sexual behaviors, and also intravenous drug use, stigmas surrounding those behaviors, and the communities that were most heavily affected by the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
In your book, you also examine this idea of normalcy.
Right.
What is normal? What isn't? What was traditional? And it all depended on where you live and where you're from and how you view things. That idea of normalcy is a theme that goes through all the pages of your book.
Right, and so Ryan really desperately wanted to be normal. Because he was dealing with hemophilia, that prevented him from being normal, and at the same time, because he did not share the characteristics that many communities who were affected by HIV and AIDS shared, he became kind of the normal face or the innocent face of AIDS. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that he was from Indiana and he was a Midwestern teenager. I mean, how more typical, more kind of American or normal, quote unquote, could you get? So there's this battle over kind of who's normal, who's not normal, and what sort of values we assign or judgments we assign to normality.
And that contrasts with the larger population that was dealing with this and people losing friends and loved ones on a constant daily basis.
Yes, exactly, right. So obviously men who have sex with men are far more likely, and this was true then and it's true now, to contract HIV. But they were perceived to be then, and I would argue now, not normal or deviant in some way. And there's this conversation in the mid 80s when Ryan contracts HIV and he becomes this household name. There's this conversation about HIV and AIDS finding their way into the general population. The idea being that folks who are outside of the general population were the ones who were affected. And only now, in the mid 80s, when straight people are being infected or kind of so-called normal boys are being affected, that's when it becomes this really scary and problematic disease that needs to be wrestled with.
Only then.
Only then.
Right. So you look into how fear and ignorance managed to bring out the abrasive and ugly side of people in a lot of these situations, especially in their treatment of Ryan and his family, and then how the depiction of Kokomo was portrayed in the media as well.
Right. So I mean, just like a lot of other things in the book and in this story, there are multiple sides to it. So on one hand, yes, there are these really vicious attacks that Ryan and his family encounter and have to deal with, right, as he's struggling to get back to school in the Kokomo area. At the same time, Kokomo and Rocheville kind of become scapegoats in a way, right? And they are depicted as uglier than I think the people there deserve to be treated, right? Because it was very much a very vocal minority in those communities that sought to prevent Ryan from going to school, and they were nevertheless kind of all painted with a broad brush, and that obscured a lot of the kindness that was present in those communities. I mean, Ryan had friends, his family had friends and support in those communities, and it also obscured the fact that there was, as you mentioned earlier, tremendous uncertainty about this disease nationwide, and tremendous ignorance and ugliness. So the notion that this can be kind of localized within Kokomo and Rocheville kind of spoke to larger, I think, stereotypes about rural communities, right, small towns, the Midwest, and a lot of that was just not productive and allowed a lot of people, I think, looking in to say, well, at least we're not like the folks in Kokomo. So there was this kind of scapegoating that was going on at the same time.
And people looked at this as a big city problem.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, exactly. So, initial reports in the 80s coming out of the CDC said that this is a New York City problem or a San Francisco problem. And of course, HIV and AIDS, and I think a lot of people don't know this, I mean, it had at that point been around for at least 60 years, right? It had not kind of erupted as this epidemic until around then, and that's really kind of, but it also became known as this gay plague or this gay disease, and only with the emergence of HIV and AIDS in communities that were less stigmatized did it become this kind of national concern or a global concern.
Talk to me a little bit about the research that went into this, especially when it came to watching the media coverage that happened at that time, the news reports that you saw and read, and what that said to you as someone examining media and how they covered this story.
Right, so, this was a huge media story. This was enormous, and part of the reason it was so big was some of the things that we talked about earlier concerning, Ryan being this kind of acceptable face or this innocent or normal face of AIDS. But reporters, journalists descended upon Kokomo and Rocheville from across the country and really around the world. And I looked at a lot of television reports from Fort Wayne, from local stations here, from national news outlets, so NBC Nightly News. I mean, everybody was here covering this story, and a lot of these themes concerning kind of innocence and acceptability and normality, those were really the themes that kind of jumped out at me, right? So a lot of people there who were involved in the saga saw this as a way for the media to kind of blame someone or a population for AIDS stigma or anti-AIDS kind of discrimination. And so they viewed a lot of this as kind of outsiders coming in and pointing the finger in many ways. And I think there is some validity to that, but also I think the news media wanted a way to talk about AIDS that enabled them to circumvent thornier questions about anti-gay discrimination or anti-drug stigma. This is also at the height of the war on drugs. And it's not unlike how politicians right after Ryan White's death in 1990 kind of used him in a sense to pass legislation, much needed legislation for AIDS relief, but with his name embedded in that legislation. So the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, which lives on as the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, but it's just telling that he becomes the face, right, of that legislation, but also of the AIDS epidemic and news media coverage of that epidemic at that moment.
And reporting at that time was journalists were trying to learn more about this as a greater story and a greater issue while looking at it in this place where it typically didn't pop up.
Exactly, right. And I think that enabled folks to talk about it in an appealing way, right? To the extent that something like this can be appealing, but one that would have kind of resonance nationwide.
Professor Renfro, why did this topic interest you?
So this story kind of loomed over my childhood, and so I learned about HIV and AIDS through the story of Ryan White, and obviously I was kind of told a very kind of simplistic sort of morality tale about Ryan White, and there are certain elements of that story that are true, but also it's a far more complex story, as I hopefully illuminate in the book.
And a lot of people, you know, when you mention Ryan White, even in this state, don't remember or provide the respect that that story deserves.
Right, exactly. So it is told as simply a tale of, well, they were mean to him, and yes, of course, Ryan was, you know, resilient, this incredibly brave, courageous individual, but also the story was also used in really kind of problematic ways, and oftentimes in these simplistic retellings of the story, that gets lost. And I wanted to recapture some of that and maybe make people think a little bit more deeply about the story.
What do you want people to take away from this story that really happened in the early stages of this epidemic?
Yeah, I'd love for people to think more deeply about how the concept of innocence is used and operationalized, and how it serves to indict certain communities. And also, I'd love for people to kind of think more deeply about the fact that, yes, we've made these tremendous strides, but HIV and AIDS, even in the United States, are, you know, tremendous problems. And you know, the epidemic is not over, as activists in the 80s and 90s and still today say. So I would like for people to really consider that fact.
All right. The book is called The Life and Death of Ryan White, AIDS and Inequality in America. Tell us when it goes on in bookstores and when we can order.
So it's available for pre-order now wherever you get your books, and it's $24.95 paperback, so that's very affordable. And it is officially published on October 22nd.
Okay. Professor Renfro, great to see you. Thanks for stopping by.
Really appreciate it.